Hello, intro students. So, today we're going to be continuing with our discussion on groups. So there's some basic terms and terminology that we need to go over really quickly. First, not all social groups are made of people who are actually interacting with each other or actually even know each other. Those are called aggregates. So imagine a large group of people walking down a busy sidewalk, all walking in the same direction. Just because they're all walking in a group doesn't mean that they're actually together. They could just all happen to be headed in the same direction for something. Then now we have categories. Categories are commonly used in sociology to talk about large groups of people. So categories can be people, objects, events that have similar characteristics and are, especially when talking about people, the people see those characteristics as being significant and are therefore classified together. Now, we also have primary and secondary groups. Primary groups are those groups we're closest with. It would be our families. They would be our very close friends. Secondary groups have actually replaced primary groups as our main social interaction on a day-to-day basis. So secondary groups are those people that we interact with on a regular basis, but we don't really have a very strong social connection to them. So for instance, people who work certain jobs that you come into contact with them are your coworkers. There's any number of examples we could come up with, but these are people that we interact with far more than we do our primary groups at this point in history. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be the other way around, that the primary group was the one that you spent all your time with. But with modern society, primary groups are typically strained and are living geographically very much separated from one another. So then we have what every high school movie is based on: in-group, out-groups. In-groups are those groups that one feels loyalty towards. There's a high degree of conformity. This is in-group, out-group, group dynamics is what we're ultimately talking about here. So if you're a part of an in-group, and the in-group is defining itself in antagonism to the out-group, which, by the way, is the definition of an out-group, the group one feels antagonism towards, then you happen to say like something about the out-group. Well, you might end up getting pushed out of the in-group that you're a part of. So these group memberships end up enforcing very strict degrees of conformity. Now that is different than your reference group. Now I hope you notice that each one of these concepts and the ways that humans form groups are similar, and there are connections between them, but that there are also fine distinctions. So for instance, a reference group would be people who set a standard for us. Now that could be someone that you admire as a hero, that could be a historical figure, it could be your in-group among your peers, it could be a part of your primary group. And so you can see how these different kinds of groups can intersect with one another. The main thing with reference group is that it's groups of people that set a standard that we try to live up to. Now, this brings us to social networks. Social networks are people that we're connected with. Say, wow, no kidding. What else can you tell us, Dr. Harden? Well, social networks. Think of yourself as a hub on a wheel, like a bicycle wheel. And there are all these spokes that are shooting out from you. Those would be all the different people you're connected with. Then think of all the people that they're connected with outside of you. So what you end up seeing is social networks actually get very complex very quickly. And we're going to come back to this concept of social networks. It's important that you understand it, especially when we get to Stanley Milgram's small world phenomenon study. And we'll be talking about that shortly. So we also have cliques. Cliques are kind of like in-groups. They can certainly be in-groups. But cliques are any cluster of people within a larger group that choose to interact with one another. And so they could be in groups, or they could be just groups of people who enjoy playing a game together, a particular game. I know when I was in high school, I was a big chess geek. And so I started my high school's chess club. And you could definitely have called the chess team a clique, but we were not in any way an in-group. I mean, we weren't going to, kick someone out if they happened to like playing checkers too. Now, social network analysis and the different connections that we have with one another has led to what's called social network analysis. Social network analysis is a way of plotting out how everyone is connected with everyone else. Now, during the Iraq invasion in 2003, when Saddam Hussein went into hiding, social scientists working for the U.S. government were actually able to use social network analysis to find him. And so how does this work? Well, you don't know where the person you're actually looking for might be. All right, so going with the example of Saddam Hussein. And you may not know where the people in his inner circle might be. But you might be able to locate people connected to people in his inner circle. And that would lead you then to the inner circle, or at least someone in the inner circle. Now, not everyone in the inner circle might know where Saddam Hussein was. But if you keep using this to trace out the networks, eventually you're going to come to someone who does know where he is, and you can get that information, and that is what happens. All right, so enough of the terminology. I think that that's enough for our purposes. Let's start talking about some of these interesting studies in history, particularly the small world phenomenon study, which I told you we were going to be discussing. Stanley Milgram, who is considered a major figure in psychology, in particularly social psychology, he hypothesized that every human being was connected to every other human being by at least 6 degrees. Now, those degrees would be other people. So, I might not know you, but I might know someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows you. If that makes sense. I mean, those would be the degrees. The other people would be the degrees. So, Milgram started this whole 6 degrees of separation thing. There have been movies about it. It was a study done in 1967. All right. Now, Milgram died in 1984. He lived from 1933 to 1984. And he claimed, so he would have letters, and the letters would say something like, on the envelope, John Smith, New York City. And then they would give it to someone in, say, Houston, Texas. So that person in Houston might not know anyone. Well, they probably do know some people directly in New York City, but for the sake of the example, let's say that they don't. Let's say that they know somebody in New England area, though. So they send it to the person they know in the New England area. Now, the person in the New England area might not know people in New York City specifically, but they probably know somebody in New York State. And you send it to someone in New York State. Now, that person in New York State will probably know some people, at least, in New York City. So they send it to the people they know in New York City. And you can see how it just keeps getting closer and closer to whoever this John Smith is in New York City. Now, Milgram argued that he did this study and found that it only took 6 moves or less. This actually led to 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. The idea that Kevin Bacon, the actor, has been in so many different movies that you can tie him to anyone in Hollywood in 6 moves or less. This actually led even to a drinking game called the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. And so here's how the game would work. You would name an actor and name 2 actors, and you would say in 2 moves. Well, then that would mean that these 2 actors never starred together, but the first actor starred with an actor who starred with another actor who starred with the second one. And that you can connect them in that way. And if you can find the connection, then the person who poses the challenge has to drink. If you can't come up with a connection, then the people who fail to come to the connection have to drink themselves. So what I learned from watching college lectures online, a new drinking game. Now, there's a major problem, though, with Stanley Milgram. He lied. With the small world phenomenon study, he never actually did the study. And Judith Kleinfeld in 2002, so this was 2002, this was long after Milgram had already died. She decided to go back to Milgram's original notes, which she did, and found that they were fabricated. So, an important part of science is replication, or in this case, doing the study to begin with. So, Judith Kleinfeld actually did the study, and she found at best, because she ran several different trials, she said the best that she found was 30% of the letters actually met their mark, found the target. Some were as low as only 5% success rate. So what does this ultimately mean? What this ultimately means is that our social networks are actually more insulating than Stanley Milgram had ever realized or ever thought. And you know, the small world phenomenon, it's a nice idea, right? I mean, it kind of makes you want to get all your friends together in around a bonfire and sing Kumbaya or something. It's like we're all together, we're all in this together. But actually what we find is that people end up forming their social networks based on the characteristics that they find most important about themselves, whether that be in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, race, ethnicity, what have you. And so while you might be very well connected within your own social network, your social network also cuts you off from other social networks where people end up having different characteristics than you. Now, this can also lead to perpetuating social inequality. So say that there's an opportunity for a job, but that opportunity for the job is only well known in certain circles. Well, when people talk about certain circles, they're talking about the social networks, right? So there could be somebody who has different characteristics who is very well qualified for the job, but who may never even hear that the job was available because they weren't a part of the social networks who were made aware of the opportunity. All right. So some other basic concepts before we move on to some other studies. Group dynamics. It was a term I used earlier when talking about in-group, out-group, group dynamics. Group dynamics themselves are just the ways that individuals affect the group and the ways that the group affect individuals. And so every group has group dynamics, and every group is going to develop slightly different group dynamics. Not every group is going to follow the same thing. So, a small group. When talking about small groups, the individual means more. The individual has more power. The individual is more important. And so a small group is a group where every individual can interact with every other individual. And the more people you add to the group, the more stability you get with the group. Because in a small group, say you have a dyad, which is the smallest group possible of 2 people. If one person leaves the dyad, then the group no longer exists. Whereas if you have 100 people in your group, and one person leaves, then many people probably wouldn't even notice. All right. Then obviously in terminology, triads, a group of 3 people. A coalition. Now coalitions are an interesting aspect of group dynamics. Coalitions occur when 2 or more people end up forming an in-group within a group against other people still within that group. Now, let's use a triad as our example. Say that you have 3 people in a work group, and 2 of those people end up deciding that for whatever reason they don't like the third person. So they've just formed a coalition. But they're still having to work with the person. So they might do petty things like put grunt work off onto the person, or refuse to do their part of things to force the other person to end up doing work. There's any number of things that coalitions end up engaging in to solidify the coalition itself socially, as well as to push out whoever the other person may be, or people. So, in talking about that, that brings us to our next study, which was done by John Darley and Bib Latane in 1968. And this was a study on helping behaviors, and how helping behaviors end up working with group size. So, let me set it up for you. Here's what they did. They would have college freshmen come in and record themselves talking about difficulty that they were having in just being a college freshman. So, adjusting to a different style of education. And college is very different from high school. Adjusting to this transitionary period of moving from childhood or adolescence into adulthood. And so talking about holding down a job, what have you. Now, in the recording, the researchers would have the students also talk about that they had would often have grand mal seizures because they suffered from epilepsy. And so they would talk about that and the medical condition as being an added dimension of difficulty that they have to deal with in being college students, new college students. All right, so that was just the recording. Now, here's the actual study. They would have college freshmen come into the lab who didn't know what was going on. Then they would go into these sound booths. And they would think that they were talking to a real person in another sound booth, but it was the recordings that had been done earlier. So the students would start talking about the difficulties they were having, and then when it was the recording's turn, the recording would start, and there are these preset kinds of questions so as to not cue in the real person, that they're not talking to another real person, but just a recording. Then the recordings would also have in them the person going into a grand mal seizure. And so they would suddenly go silent, they would start making thrashing sounds, and the question that Biblitain and John Darley were trying to answer is how many people would go and help. Well, here's what we found. Or what they found. If there's two people, so that would be one real person and then the recording, so a dyad, 100% helped. People will help if they feel like no one else is going to. Here's the interesting part. The more people you add, the less likely people are to help. So this is in terms of probability. This is not an absolute statement. So if you go down to a triad, or you go up to a triad, where now you have 3 people, 80% helped in the study. If you go up to groups of 6 people, 60% help. So what's going on here? Why is it that the bigger the group becomes, the less likely it is that someone will help? Well, there's a term for it. In psychology, it's called the bystander effect. In sociology, we call it the diffusion of responsibility. So, this is basically what I just said. The larger the group, the more people feel someone else will help, so they don't feel like they need to. A famous example of this comes from 1964 with Kitty Genovese. Now, Kitty Genovese was living in New York City and was walking home from her job in the evening. The sun was starting to go down, and she was mugged. And during the mugging, she was severely injured. Now, she had been walking between 2 apartment buildings to get to her own home. And the apartment buildings were packed. I mean, lights were on, people were home. People heard what was going on. They were throwing their windows up and yelling down at the mugger, screaming, "I'm calling the cops, you better get out of here," things like that. Well, the mugger did run off. Kitty Genovese was still alive, and she was crying out for help. And no one went down to help her. No one actually called the police. And when the mugger heard that there were no sirens coming and that there were no police on the way, that, as far as he could tell, he went back and killed Kitty Genovese. Now, when the police were finally called, too late for Kitty, unfortunately, and were interviewing the people, or what they were, the people were saying in the apartment buildings, they were all saying similar things. They were saying, well, I mean, I saw all these other people were home, I saw the lights on, I saw them yelling down, so I figured that I didn't need to, and if I called 911, that would tie up the 911 line, and other people with emergencies then wouldn't be able to get in or get in to talk to a 911 operator. So I didn't want to clog the lines. Other people said things like, well, I have to get up early for work tomorrow. I'm really busy, and I figured somebody who had more free time on their hands could handle this. Other people said, well, I'm just really busy in my life in general, and I didn't want to have to take time to go and testify and go to court and all of those sorts of things. Now, does this mean these were just bad, morally reprehensible people that we can just condemn and feel good about ourselves, that we would help? No, that's not the lesson to walk away with here. The point is that this is a well-documented human phenomenon. And the more people you add, the less likely someone feels personally responsible to help. There's a way to stop the diffusion of responsibility. So let's say in a horrible thought experiment, and hopefully this never happens to any of you, but let's just say that you get into a really bad car accident, and there's a group of people who see you and they're standing around. Do not assume that just because there's a large group of people that someone's going to call the police, that someone's going to call an ambulance. Point at someone in the crowd just to be safe, because maybe somebody is calling, but you want to make sure the diffusion of responsibility doesn't kick in. So you point to somebody, an individual, and you say, you go call 911. Now when you do that, that stops the diffusion of responsibility, because you've just made that one person responsible, and they will go and do it. All right. Now, for the next studies that we're going to be talking about, we need to talk about leaders and what a leader is. People oftentimes talk about leaders and followers as if these were character types that are just ingrained in some people. And that's not the case at all. We all take different approaches to leading and to following. And you've probably heard the saying, the cliche, someone to be a good leader has to know how to be a good follower. So, a leader is someone who simply is able to influence other people. It doesn't mean that they necessarily get their way. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have authority. It just means that they're able to influence other people. There's also many different types of leaders, and it's important to understand that people are not just leaders or followers, but oftentimes switch off in those roles. And so sometimes you're a leader in a group, say like a group of friends, and sometimes you're the follower, one of the followers. And that's okay. That's simply being social. If you wanted to be the leader of your group of friends 24/7, you'd probably start to face some resentment from your friends. You might lose some friends. All right. Now, like I said, there are many different types of leadership styles, many different ways of being a leader. So let's look at some of them. And this is not by any means exhaustive listing. The first is instrumental leader. An instrumental leader is kind of a goal-oriented, task-oriented leader. So they try to keep the group moving towards its goals. Then we have the expressive leader. Expressive leaders oftentimes don't get credit for being leaders, but they're incredibly important. They're also called socio-emotional leaders. So, this is an individual who tries to decrease conflict in a group by increasing harmony. I'll give you an example. Say you have a manager at work who is an instrumental leader, and say that this manager is can be unreasonable or micromanages sometimes, and you get frustrated with them. Now, you can't just go and blow your top at the manager. You probably lose your job if you do that. But there's probably going to be someone that you can go and let off steam to and complain about the manager and talk about your frustrations. And that helps to decrease those frustrations and increases then the harmony in the group, and you're able to go on with your day and get your work done without feeling the seething resentment and anger, because you were allowed to express yourself and you felt heard. And that's the role of the expressive leader. Now, while expressive leaders oftentimes don't get the credit, they are incredibly important in groups, because groups would devolve into conflict on a regular basis if it weren't for this type of leader. Now, we also see particular leadership styles. And leadership styles are the ways that people express their leaderships. So there are three basic leadership styles that we're going to discuss. And then we'll be ready to discuss a study on this. The first one is the authoritarian leader. The authoritarian leader is one who leads by giving orders. They give commands. They're domineering. Then we have the democratic leader. The democratic leader tries to lead by reaching consensus with the group. So they might take a vote. What does everyone else think? They take in other people's views into consideration. Then we have the laissez-faire leader. Now remember, laissez-faire is French for just hands off. Often like the U.S. government was described as being laissez-faire in the 19th century in regards to economic matters. Now that's not entirely the case. There is a body of legislation being built up over the course of the 19th century, as well as judicial precedent, all in regards to the economy. So they weren't entirely laissez-faire, but they're often characterized that way. I'm chasing a rabbit hole. Bring it back. Laissez-faire leader. An individual who leads by being highly permissive. So I don't know. What do you all think? You all do your own thing. I'm sure that we'll accomplish whatever it is we're trying to accomplish. Now, this brings us to the study. So, 1958. Ronald Libet and Ralph White do a study on leadership styles in boys, where they look at the three major ones we just talked about. So they have a bunch of different groups of boys, and they'll have a boy who is assigned to be an authoritative leader, a boy who is assigned to be a democratic leader, and a boy who is assigned to be a laissez-faire leader. And they wanted to, then they would give them goals to achieve, and they wanted to see which leadership style worked best. Now, this was 1958, so keep in mind that you're talking about the height of the Cold War. You're talking about the Red Scare, McCarthyism, all going on around this time period. So what Libet and White were really wanting to do was to add scientific evidence to the belief that, or the ideology, that democratic leadership styles work best as compared to the USSR and their authoritarian leadership style. The issue is that that's kind of bad science. You don't start a study to try to prove something. You have a hypothesis, and then you go and you test that hypothesis. You don't go into a study to prove something, because then your biases will end up influencing the results you get. So, what did they find out? Well, exactly what they set out to find out. That the democratic leadership style was best. The authoritarian